way John uses the temple as a major image, first of all, of Jesus, and the suggestion that in the future, with the gift of the Spirit, that image will also apply to believers. In this session, we're going to continue that by looking at the Passion narrative, the unique features of the narrative where we see that phrase enacted, who spoke of the temple of his body, when Jesus had said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. We'll see that happen in the narrative. So just a reminder of some of the things we were looking at in our earlier session. The fact that Jesus is called the temple, the phrases related to the temple in chapter 2, and the expression used of the temple, my Father's house, in chapter 2, and then in chapter 14, my Father's house, meaning now the Father's household, where God, Father, Spirit, Jesus dwell within believers, making the believers a place of divine indwelling, and therefore a temple. And also the reference to the Father's house in the Old Testament, always relating to the household. So that's the background we were looking at earlier, before now we move into some of the unique features of the Johannine Passion. So one of those things is to see the way the Passion narrative actually presents Jesus as the temple builder, the one who will raise up the new temple. One of the first things to notice about John is it begins in a garden. John chapter 18 verse 1, after saying these things, Jesus went with his disciples across the Kidron Valley where there was a garden. No other gospel mentions that. Similarly, at the end of the Passion, the garden returns. Now there was a garden in the place where he was crucified, and in the garden there was a new tomb, in which no one had ever been made. So the Passion narrative in John is situated within a garden. We get the phrase that the cross was situated in the middle of the garden. We find that phrase in John 19, verse 18. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side. And John adds, with Jesus in the middle. Now when we take those phrases, garden, garden, and we've got the cross in the middle, we're reminded of the book of Genesis chapter 2. The most significant garden in the Old Testament was the Garden of Eden. And in the middle of the Garden of Eden was the tree of life. We get the cross in the middle of the garden. And at the foot of the cross stands a woman and a man. The woman who's only ever named in this gospel as woman and mother. Now these were the 2 terms used to speak of the mother of Jesus back at Cana. She's named woman and mother. So John, in a sense, is recreating the Genesis Garden of Eden. So John's theology is going to be the Passion as a recreation. The Synoptic Gospels use atonement symbolism, but that's not John's theology of the cross. It's a theology of creation and recreation. As well as the iconography of the cross situated in a garden, if we look back to the beginning of the Gospel of John, it actually starts with the words in Genesis 1, in the beginning. So that's the clue that John is presenting a theology of creation. But not only that phrase, but I would suggest that the entire structure of John's prologue, verses 1 to 18, is based on the structure of the book of Genesis. So just very briefly, The structure of the book of Genesis begins with an introduction, ends with a short conclusion. And then in between, we have set out in parallel the creation on the various days of the week. So day 1, we get the separation of light and darkness. Day 2, the separation, waters above from waters below. And day 3, separation of the water and the land. Now those are 3 acts of separation. Now days 4, 5 and 6, the actions are population, the population, and they relate to the first 3 days. So where day 1 we get light and darkness, day 4 we get the population. So we get the creation of the sun. And the darkness is populated with the stars and the moon, the planets. Day 5, the waters above are populated with the birds of the air. The waters below populated with the fish. It's very carefully patterned. And on day 6, the land is populated with all the land creatures. And including in that are the creation of a man and a woman made in God's image, Genesis 1. But creation doesn't finish there, because all of these acts of creation lead to the 7th day, the Sabbath. Okay, and then we're here, and God finished the work that God had created. Now, when we look at the Gospel of John, we see a very similar pattern. Introduction, conclusion, 3 sets of parallel statements. So let's have a look at John. Begins with an introduction, the first 3 verses. God and the Word in eternity. And the prologue ends with God and the Word now in history, and so the image changes from God and Word to Father and Son. So there's a change in the symbolism, in the wording. God and the Word in eternity, Father and Son in the narrative, in the world. Now, between those phrases, the introduction and the conclusion, we get a number of what we might call stanzas, verses. Begins with a description of the light and darkness, just like Genesis, the first day of creation. This is something that is visible, light, darkness. So the first stanza is what's visible. The second stanza, we hear about John, and John is known as the voice. So we're talking about what can be heard, what we can hear. And then it moves in verses 10 to 13 to what's the experience of the Word in the world. And this is when we hear about 2 experiences. He came to his own did not receive him. And some did receive him. So we get the 2 experiences. When we move then to verse 14 and the second half of the prologue, there's a shift in language from reported speech to first-person testimony. So verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory. So it's first person, we saw. Then when we have John's witness, John speaks in the first person. And finally, the experience, how the Word is experienced, we get 2 gifts. A gift instead of a gift. The law was given through Moses, God's first gift. The true gift came through Jesus, a second gift. Now this is where sometimes your translations do not help. The word gift is the Greek word charis, and that's followed by the word anti. Charis, anti, charitos. A gift instead of a gift. Unfortunately, the translators translate the word charis as it was used in the writings of Paul. where Paul speaks of charis, and it's translated as grace. So the translators carry over that word into John, instead of allowing John to give it his own meaning. A gift instead of a gift. The law was given through Moses, the true gift came through Jesus Christ. Now, if you look at the screen, you'll notice that there's something missing. When we look at the Johannine structure and the parallel structure in Genesis, the seventh day is missing in John. This is because in John, creation was not finished in the beginning. In John chapter 5, you find the phrase, "My Father is still working and so am I." So John is running a theology that creation is continuing and has been continuing and will not be brought to completion until the cross. And I'll point that out to you. So there is no equivalent to the seventh day creation of Sabbath in the Johannine prologue for that reason. So all I was doing there was trying to show you that the gospel begins with allusions to Genesis and creation. And then at the cross, those allusions return. That the cross is presented as a new Garden of Eden.